So I want to take a few minutes to look at how we got to this point where the president seems to have more unofficial unilateral powers than he has official powers. How do we get to where we think of the presidency as being the strongest of the three branches instead of number two? How did we get from the president merely being the person who executes the will of Congress to being a rival to Congress's power and someone who's trying to set the agenda for Congress instead of following Congress's lead? So the constitutional powers haven't changed much. But nevertheless, the power of the presidency has grown dramatically. And part of that is having presidents who were very skillful negotiators, very persuasive. Some of that has been assertion of power especially during times of crisis. And the realization on the part of Congress, a willingness on the part of Congress to let the president take the lead. This has led to something that political scientists refer to as the imperial presidency. That is that president as seeing as the most powerful. And then we expect the president to take the lead. That we expect the president to submit a budget every year, and to set the budget agenda, to take the lead on every issue, to push the policy agenda forward, rather than expecting that of the members of Congress. Even though it is the House of Representatives that has to institute any bills having to do with money, we look to the president to do that. And he has to get somebody from the House to introduce his budget, but we still consider it the president's budget. So how does that happen? Part of it has to do with just the growth of the government. The growth of the bureaucracy, the growth of the role of the government, and the fact that at least the top level staff are appointed by the president and are therefore loyal to the president. They are seen as part of his administration. Their power is connected to his. Instead of Congress being elected separately, having their own base of power. So this expansion of the role of the president started really early. Thomas Jefferson was our third president, and he went ahead. He was the one who established the principle of inherent powers. Even though he had been an anti-federalist, which was opposed to having such a strong central government in the first place, when he was the one in charge, he builds on the power. 25 years later, Andrew Jackson would build on it even more. Jackson was a populist, and if you will recall, before he was elected president, he had been involved in that 1824 election where he got the most votes, but he didn't get a majority of the electors, and it ends up being chosen by the House of Representatives, and they chose John Quincy Adams instead. So Andrew Jackson came in with a bit of a chip on his shoulder about that, but he was very much a populist, definitely somebody to play to the people as his power base, and he was the one to adopt that role that as president he was the head of the party, and to assume that leadership role of the party. Franklin D. Roosevelt was the one who expanded the powers most dramatically. He was quite probably our most activist president ever. He's the one who exercised far and away the most vetoes. He was involved in that court packing scheme we talked about a while back. He was facing unprecedented challenges in the forms of the Great Depression and then World War II. And in responding to especially that challenge of the Depression, he completely revolutionized the way people saw the role of the government. So instead of the government being there just to as sort of a referee between citizens to ensure that the laws are being followed and everybody's playing fair, Roosevelt envisions the government as providing a safety net, providing a basic safety net through programs like unemployment insurance and Social Security, so that we won't have something like the Great Depression where we have millions of people made completely destitute with no means of supporting themselves at all. Another big moment and sort of a moment of retreat from this imperial presidency happened in the 1970s. And there's two big incidents that really highlighted the problems with allowing the president to be so powerful. Under Roosevelt, that was also the time when Congress started having that practice of writing laws with vague language and space where they just said, this is our intention, we'll let the executive departments figure out the details through regulation, sort of giving the executive departments blank checks to fill in the blanks of the law. In the 70s, you have, in 1971, the leak of the Pentagon Papers, which exposed that the nation had been far more involved in doing things during the Vietnam War that had been publicly denied, that they had been lying to the public, misrepresenting what was going on in that war, and that had gone on through several presidencies. And then, of course, Watergate, that scandal involving the burglaries of the Democratic National Committee and Nixon's participation in the subsequent follow-up. Both of those demonstrated not only how powerful that the presidency had become, but that presidents were abusing that power, and that power was endangering the lives and security of Americans. So there was sort of a recoiling back from presidents being that powerful. The reaction was to elect Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter was perhaps the nicest man to ever be our president. He very mild-mannered, and was seen sort of as the antidote to Nixon. Nixon was a very, very strong president, and Carter was the opposite. Unfortunately, that too proved to be problematic. Carter really didn't put himself forward, left Congress to do its thing, but the big mar on Carter's presidency was the tension, the blowing up of the situation between the United States and Iran. The change of the government, the revolution in Iran, the oil crisis that came out of that, which led to oil shortages, gasoline shortages, and his advice to people when they couldn't afford heating oil in the winter because it was so expensive or they just couldn't get it was to put on a sweater. And then the sort of final indignity when the U.S. embassy in Iran was attacked. A bunch of hostages were seized, and they were held hostage for over a year, and he was completely ineffective at negotiating or arranging their release. Ronald Reagan was then elected, again seen as somebody who would be a stronger president. And to finish up that Iran hostage story, Reagan's transition team negotiated the release of the hostages before he was even inaugurated, so that the hostages were in fact released on his first day as president, sort of symbolically underscoring his self-portrayal as a stronger leader. George W. Bush was the closest we've gotten back to arguably back to the imperial presidency. He had the context of the 9/11 terrorist attacks and the reaction to that, allowing, in fact, demanding that the presidency be given more power to react to that emergency situation. Barack Obama was criticized for, again, being both just by character and by policy a less of a forceful imperial president, more conciliatory, more interested in consensus building rather than do it because I said so kind of a president. On the other hand, other people saw him as very much an imperial president. This goes to the polarization that's happened in the country. Those who thought he should have done more saw him as not strong enough. And on the other hand, using that consensus building, he was able to get a healthcare plan, healthcare reform actually implemented. And since he did it rather than through presidential unilateral action, he did it through working with Congress. It's proven very difficult to change. It's always stronger when the president and Congress work together. Impeachment, and I want to point out, it's always stronger when the president and Congress work together. It is also the case that much of the powers exercised by the president, if Congress wanted to check them, they could. There just has to be enough will in Congress to do it. And Congress has found it since FDR. Congress has found it convenient to write those sort of blank spaces into laws and let the executive departments fill them in with regulation. Even when the Supreme Court ruled that Congress tried challenging when a president regulated in a way they did not like, they tried to say we overrule it. And the Supreme Court said, no, if you're going to write blank spaces, if you're going to write them blank checks, then they get to fill them in. You can't do that. They still do it. They could very easily take that power, a lot of that power back if they chose to. What they found is that they can get a lot of attention yelling and screaming that they are opposed to the president, but they don't have to take responsibility for doing it themselves. They can get themselves reelected and pass the blame on to the president for things that either do or don't get done. The ultimate check on the president's power, though, is the power of Congress to impeach a president. That impeachment is the power to remove somebody from office, and it's not only presidents that are subject to impeachment. That is just the most high-profile office where we see it, and we saw it recently. So impeachable offenses are, quote-unquote, treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. And this is a legal, what they call a term of art, high crimes and misdemeanors. It basically means things you can be impeached for. You can be impeached for things you can be impeached for. Yes, that is somewhat circular. It means high crimes doesn't mean particularly heinous crimes. It means crimes committed by a person in high office. So it's abuse of the office. And the misdemeanors would be lesser abuses of the office. So even you could be impeached for failing to uphold your oath, even if you haven't committed a crime. It's not a criminal procedure. You do not have to have committed a crime in order to be impeached. Clearly, treason or bribery would be crimes. Just what falls under high crimes and misdemeanors is a little more in the realm of legal precedent and open, subject to interpretation. Anyway, the process of impeachment. Impeachment is brought by the House of Representatives. They can impeach the president. They forward charges and the ways they think what the president has done to need removing from office. These are called the articles of impeachment. And the House puts forward the charges, and then the Senate holds a trial. The trial is presided over by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. So an impeachment trial involves all parts of the federal government. The president is the one on trial, the Chief Justice is there presiding, and one house of Congress is prosecuting, and the other house is sitting as the jury. This has been done 3 times. 3 presidents have been impeached. Andrew Johnson, that is the guy, the vice president, Lincoln's vice president who took over when Lincoln was assassinated. He was impeached for violating the Tenure in Office Act, which had been put in place to say that presidents could not remove from office without Senate's approval people that they could not put in office without Senate approval. So this applied to like the secretaries of the various departments that need Senate advice, and the Senate needs to consent to the nomination before the appointment is made. This was passed to keep Johnson from removing Lincoln's department heads, specifically Department of War. That's what the Department of Defense used to be called. A little bit more honest. The Department of War Secretary, Edmund Stanton, because the two kind of hated each other, and they were looking for a way to impeach Johnson because the radical Republicans were very, very angry at him for having pardoned so many top Confederates. So Johnson was impeached for trying to dismiss Edwin Stanton. They almost removed him from office. He missed it by 1 vote. From that point on, though, they had demonstrated that they had enough support, the radical Republicans had enough support in the House and the Senate to override his veto. And he vetoed a whole bunch of stuff, and they kept the whole Reconstruction package. He kept vetoing it, they kept overriding it. So once he was impeached, he really lost power. Bill Clinton was impeached for lying to Congress, and Donald Trump was impeached for abuse of power and obstruction of Congress. We've had 3 presidents impeached. We've never had a president removed from office by the Senate. However, Nixon resigned from office rather than face impeachment because it was pretty clear that he would be removed from office. So rather than have that happen and set that precedent, Nixon resigned, and as I mentioned before, his vice president, Gerald Ford, became president, and one of his very first acts was to pardon Nixon for any criminal acts he may or may not have committed, so that just kind of put an end to the Watergate situation. So where do we stand now in terms of the power of the president? One of the things I found very interesting during Trump's presidency has been the ways his attempts to wield the power of the presidency have caused Congress and the state and local governments to rediscover the ways that they have to block or to counter a strong president when they want to. So that reinvigoration of the whole system in ways that haven't been exercised in a while. So that'll probably continue to be an ongoing negotiation throughout time, but I think it's a positive thing for state and local governments to realize that they can affect change, positive change in their communities, or prevent harm, that they have the power to do those things.